Good morning, and I welcome you all to today's interview by ESI. I am Gokul, a third year BSMS student from School of Biology, ISO Tirunanthapuram. With me, I have Vidya Rashmi, a first year BSMS student from ISO Tirunanthapuram. Today, with us, we have Dr. Ullas Karanth, son of Dr. Kota Shivaram Karanth, one of the Gnanapita Award winners from my state, Karnataka. Dr. Karanth is a conservation biologist. He's been working with conservation of animals, specifically tigers, and his unique techniques of conservation has brought him recognition all through the world. For his immense contribution in the field of research, he's been recognized and awarded several awards, including one of the nation's highest civilian awards, Padma Shri. Dr. Karanth, it's a pleasure having you with us today. And yeah, so
Good
before
to
I
be with
begin,
you guys.
thank you, sir. So before I begin, I would like to give you a little introduction about ESI. ESI is a ecological society of ISA. It's a relatively new club in the campus compared to other clubs. So ESI has been conducting a lot of programs and has been organizing a lot of competitions in the recent past. And considering the locality or the area in which we are situated, it was important for us to highlight the natural surroundings we have. So yeah, so before I jump into some very technical questions regarding your research, I would like to talk about the current pandemic and the consequences because of which, and how it's affecting your research in particular, and or research in general.
Well, my research is not particularly effective because right now I'm not doing any field work. I'm doing more of the analysis of 30 years of work. Obviously, any physical activity that involves movement has been drastically restricted, so it does have an impact on research. But I think the bigger issue is because of the pandemic, there's been a movement of people back into rural areas. There's been a loss of jobs in rural areas, and there's loss of incomes in rural areas, which I think has led to a surge in poaching of wildlife. And this has been made worse because the law enforcement machinery also is busy with other COVID related things like courts and police and judges and things like that. So, this is a matter of concern rather than research right now.
And how do you think it's going to be affected in future? Do you see any high consequences on field research, basically ecology, evolution?
No, I don't think it's field research per se. All human activity is sort of cut down or disrupted because of the lockdown and its consequences. Whether the lockdown is more harmful or the whether it's been helpful or more harmful is still being debated. But one thing is clear to me as a biologist that just like measles and various other things, this virus is going to be around, and we have to learn to live with it. And some of the data uh, does suggest that, you know, uh, if we observe some precautions, the infection rates and mortality rates are not that high. So I think virus is not going to go away. Vaccination, if it comes through, may push up the number of people, push up the resistance. Uh, but we have to accept it rather than panic and just irrationally cut down on activity, because the damages from doing that, you can defer research, but livelihoods can't be deferred.
Yeah.
So, coming to the topic of tiger conservation, about your work, about your years of experiences, could you share one of your tiger encounters which is memorable to you?
There have been many encounters that are memorable. To me, seeing a tiger in the wild itself was such a rarity. I started wandering in the forests of Western Ghats in Karnataka and other places looking for tigers around 1964-65. And I did not see a wild tiger till 1982. So tiger sightings were extremely rare because wildlife was being hunted, shot, forests were being cleared, and it was a pretty dismal scenario. Actually, when I was in high school, I thought I would never see a wild tiger. I would see dead tigers which the hunters brought to the street, parade on the street. So I started seeing tigers in the 80s, and now, of course, in some of these reserves, they have become habituated to tourists, and you can see them fairly easily. I've seen many instances of tigers hunting or tigers and leopards kind of clashing with the leopards being trained. I've had many interesting instances, but your generation must realize that the very fact that you can see tigers in their natural surroundings is a very, very recent phenomena. That wasn't the case for many, many years, perhaps for a century before this.
Okay. So, apart from being extremely charismatic species, another reason for conservation of tigers is that it's an umbrella species. So, can you tell us how that is and how that works?
The way it works is it's not just tigers, but there are some species which require very large spaces for to support a viable population of a certain some of these species. You need a very large area, and this is because either they are wide ranging, they are migratory and things like that, or because they are on top of the trophic pyramid, that they are predators. So support them you need a base of prey, and below that you need a vegetation to support the herbivores. So the idea of using them for conservation is that by protecting viable population of these charismatic species or umbrella species, we are able to protect a lot of other things. The idea is not to protect tigers alone. A lot of people mistake tiger conservation as keeping a tiger and taking care of it. That's not it. It's about capturing the entire biodiversity on which the tiger kind of acts like an umbrella. The same role is played by polar bears or snow leopards in the Himalayas. These species help us protect and save a lot of other things that are there. Whereas if you start with a frog or a small species, they don't have the same kind of demands. You may, protect a small area or a particular niche, but you don't capture a lot of other biodiversity. That's the value of umbrella species.
Okay, so you've told that a tiger needs a very large area, but in a time like this where all our forests are fragmented and there are only small reserves available for tigers and the dwindling population also there, how do you as conservationists make sure that the tigers don't inbreed among themselves?
Inbreeding is the least of the problems. See, the issue is this. When I said a large area, I mean compared to a frog. Let us say you take a frog or some particular species which has a limited range and use that as an umbrella species versus using something wide ranging like a tiger. So it is in that sense I said a lot of space is needed. And also we are talking about not a single animal. We are talking about a viable population. Let's say a viable population would require about 100 tigers. You would require a few thousand kilometers, square kilometers. That's what I meant. Now, do we have enough space for tigers? We certainly do. Because if you look at the kinds of forests in which tiger population can do well, we have about 3 lakh square kilometers of such forests in India. And most of them, this area is empty of tigers. Probably only about a quarter of this area has breeding tiger populations, or even less perhaps, or even quarter, maybe 20%. So we have room for having more tigers if we bring back tiger numbers in the remaining 80% of the area. So it's not big. Even then, in a country of 3 million square kilometer land area, 300,000 is not very big, but it's still 10% of the country's land area. So I think there's enough space for tigers. It's a question of how we manage a population of that size is the issue.
Over the past few decades, wildlife conservation as a field has bloomed pretty well. So, what is the current status of tiger conservation in India, and what sort of adjustments in the government, like the norms, will be required in the future?
No, I would not say that wildlife conservation has been a roaring success in the past few decades. What I would say is that compared to 1960s, when things were really dismal, things are certainly much better. And compared to other Asian countries, possibly India has done better than most other countries. Compare, say, if you go back 60 years and now, we have done better. But that's saying that your glass is half full, but the glass is still half empty. There's a lot more that can be done, and the weaknesses are becoming obvious now that the protection mechanism is effective only in some parts of the country. You go to vast stretches of forest in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, the entire northeastern hill states. There's barely any protection for wildlife. Tigers have virtually vanished from these areas, and these are the bigger blocks of forests in India. So we need to develop models for protecting wildlife and tigers in those areas. That's certainly one thing that's true. Secondly, even in the areas where we are protecting tigers reasonably well, and you are seeing them in places like Nagarole or Bandipur or Kana, the funding priorities are very skewed. Too much money is being pumped into a few reserves, whereas a larger area, which is still under government control, where tigers can be brought back, are not receiving investments. Secondly, the investments are not going into the right things. For example, basically what you need to do is to protect the prey base from being hunted out and the forests being depleted by industry or local people. The wild tigers will come back. What we are doing is spending too much money in enrichment, building water holes, bulldozing habitats in a few areas. We are not worrying about expanding these better protected areas through both improving the protection infrastructure, relocating villages. There are things that can be done using the same money and will have a much better multiplier effect on numbers of tigers. The funding priorities and management priorities need to be improved. And the third point is the science base of our conservation is very weak. There have been very, very few good scientific studies of wildlife. For a country of our size, with the kind of manpower we have, our wildlife research output is pretty pathetic. And things haven't improved. In fact, things are getting worse because government has created a monopoly over wildlife research. It's very difficult for serious researchers from universities or research institutions or from the outside the government sector to come in. Government has kind of put a lock on it, and neither they nor others are producing good science as a result. So these are the challenges that we need to face head on and improve things.
How important is it to deal with human animal conflict? And what is the process of changing the hostile outlook of locals towards the wildlife?
I think the conflict is, in some sense, we have to recognize the conflict arises because there are animals. I talked about extensive areas in eastern and northeastern India where there are the very vast extent of forests and there is very little conflict because the wildlife has been wiped out. So the presence of conflict in some sense is because it's a price we are paying for success in bringing back wildlife. One of the consequences is numbers of animals have gone up, and when wide-ranging animal numbers go up, they move out and they come into conflict. This is what's happening. The second issue is interspersion. Because of putting roads and highways, I don't mean just national highways, the massive expansion of the rural roads program, the interspersion of human settlements and wildlife has increased in some areas, and that's another driver of conflict. So to address this, we need to be very clear that we need if you want conflict-free areas, you do need to separate people from wildlife, at least in core protected areas where you want reproducing populations of tigers and things. Second thing is, if and when there is a conflict of a serious nature, you have to either compensate the people for the damages suffered, and in many cases, you will have to eliminate the animal that is causing conflict. And these are all issues that needs to be dealt with scientifically and not emotionally. Because for a person who is living next to tigers, or a set of villages where a man-eater has gone on and killed 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 human beings, city-based people who are not at risk, who are not on the scene, saying, "Oh, the tiger is so cute, don't kill it. Let it remain there, kill more people." This kind of creates hostility to wildlife. So we have to be realistic. If there is a serious problem from a particular individual, that an individual animal has to be eliminated. And it doesn't affect the population. Tigers, for example, have 20% animal mortality rates anyway. So elimination of problem animals is also a part of conflict mitigation. And these measures are required so that local people don't turn hostile to wildlife, so that we have a balance. So when we people who are not right there facing these risks intervene in the process, saying we love the tiger, we have to be realistic. We are loving the tiger at the species level. We want tiger populations to increase. We want not 3,000, we want 10,000 tigers. But a consequence of that is that individual animals have to be sometimes eliminated. So it's a science issue. It's not just an emotion issue.
Yeah. Considering everything that's happening, are there any volunteer services or citizen science programs which we normal citizens can, be a part of in
Yeah, I think
helping
there
this
are.
conservation?
For example, our Center for Wildlife Studies for years, uh, when I was active in research, I used to involve a lot of people. In fact, Vidya Rashmi's dad came in 1989 or 90 as one of the volunteers in some of the wildlife surveys we did. So certainly we are involving people, but it's not a picnic. A lot of people have an idea that doing
True,
something
true.
with wildlife is glamorous. It's not. It's tough work, it's hard work, and sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes it's frustrating. And many other projects which do not involve going into the forest, but may involve working with the villages on the outside. There is a lot of scope for volunteers if they are sincere and interested, because a lot of urban youth are now used to picnicking, cycling, using all-terrain vehicles to go and rip apart wildlife. They just don't have the mindset for doing work seriously. It's more like there's jungle and people climb mountains and trash them. So the mindset is not about serious volunteering. There's too much frivolous use of nature. So as long as people are sincere, I think there is scope for volunteering.
Okay, that's nice. So we are almost at the end of our interview, and I'm left with one question. That is regarding how students like me studying in a research institute, a lot of us are aspiring to do research in the field of ecology in particular. Are there any thoughts for students like me?
See, I have serious concern for students like you, because when I got into wildlife research or ecological research, there were a handful of us, and there was no overt resistance from the reserve managements and the management systems. Now, what has happened is that there is active discouragement in terms of permits, access. It's become much harder for your generation to do that. And unfortunately, the scientific community has not been united in taking this problem up at higher levels and making sure these, wildlife research is not treated like a criminal activity. That's a desirable activity. If you read the Wildlife Protection Act, which is the bible by which managers look, there is not a preamble in it and a section in it saying wildlife research is fundamental to conservation. It needs to be actively encouraged, and making access easy and you know less cumbersome. None of it is there in the Wildlife Act. We have tried to reform it over years, many times. It goes halfway and then comes down. Whereas hundreds of thousands of other kinds of people are going. Today, it's easier to get a mining lease in a forest than get a wildlife research permit. So this is a problem your generation will face, and it's a battle you guys have to fight. Unfortunately, our generation hasn't won this fight. We have tried, but we have failed. So you guys have to keep, otherwise your research will be behind a computer in a lab, in genetics and fields like that. Active ecological research, for which this country is a greenfield area, there's so much scope for it, is unfortunately, it's very hard for people outside the government research institutions and the forest department to do it. This needs to change, and you got to fight your way through that.
Yes, sir. So again, it was a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Karanth, and we really appreciate you taking off some time and for agreeing to make this interview happen. And yeah, I think yeah, we are done with the interview.
Okay, thank you very much. It was great hanging out with you.
Thank you, sir. And
Thank
we
you,
would
sir.
like to invite you to our campus. I'm sure you will fall in love with the surroundings.
Yeah, sometime. Yeah,
Yes, sir.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.